All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So once again, welcome everybody. My name is Chelsea Rochman. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto and also a co-founder of the U of T trash team. I'm also a scientific advisor to Ocean Conservancy. I have been working on the issue of plastic pollution and mostly microplastics, which we're focusing on today, for about 15 years. During this time, I've watched the research field grow and the data about plastic and microplastics really pile up. Our current body of knowledge demonstrates today that there is truly a global presence of microplastics, as you'll hear more about today. It's in our oceans, it's in our freshwaters, it's in our atmosphere, and the likeliness of harm in lakes and oceans today is much better understood. As scientists have been increasing our understanding, journalists have also been sharing our findings with the public, increasing awareness about this global environmental issue. And this past October, Matt Simon, whose work we're going to highlight on our panel today, published a new book on the subject called A Poison Like No Others: How Microplastics Corrupted Our Planet and Our Bodies. Today, we're going to be kicking off this call with a really brief scene setting about microplastics, followed by a discussion of the book. And then we're going to open the last 30 minutes up to question and answer from the audience, because what we really want is for this to be an opportunity for members of the media and then the public to explore the issue and, importantly, begin to talk about what we can do to mitigate it. So with that, I want to first introduce our panelists. So as I mentioned, Matt Simon, who has been a science journalist at Wired magazine for 12 years, is the author of the book we're discussing today, as well as the author of 3 books in total. Dr. Britta Baechler is the Associate Director of Ocean Plastics Research at Ocean Conservancy. She has a PhD in Environmental Science and Management from Portland State University, where she studied the impacts of microplastics on shellfish. She also spent more than a decade working in fisheries management and research. Dr. Anja Brandon is Ocean Conservancy's Associate Director of U.S. Plastics Policy. She has a PhD in Environmental Engineering from Stanford, where she studied novel ways of breaking down plastics. Prior to joining Ocean Conservancy, she served in the office of the U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley as the lead policy advisor on issues including plastics and also oceans and water. So today, I'm going to turn it over first to Dr. Baechler, who's going to tell us a little bit about microplastics.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, Chelsea. And I will hold for a second as a couple of slides come up here. All right, so scene setting about microplastics really quickly. At the most basic level, anything larger than 5 millimeters in any dimension, which is about the width of a pencil, is considered a macroplastic. Plastics 5 millimeters in size and smaller are referred to as microplastics. But there are also nanoplastics, which are even smaller than microplastics. These are incredibly tiny, less than a micron in size, and are not even visible to the naked eye. Next slide, please. We categorize microplastics as being either primary or secondary. Primary microplastics here on the slide are intentionally manufactured to be that small size fraction, less than 5 millimeters in size. Think nurdles, or those small plastic pellets, which are melted down to form things like detergent bottles. Other examples are glitter, microbeads in personal care products, or foam balls used to fill bean bags. Next slide, please. Secondary microplastics are plastics that have degraded from those larger items that we use in our daily lives. Those include things like hard plastic fragments, fibers that shed from our clothing, or even tire particles that are shed during tire use. Next slide, please. So whether a plastic is primary or secondary is just one of the many characteristics of any given microplastic. And a different combination of characteristics may have different impacts on the environment or an organism that encounters this plastic. For example, some animals might be attracted to plastics of certain colors, which we've seen, which could in turn impact the likelihood of that animal mistaking it for food and actually ingesting it. In another example, chemical additives in one microplastic might affect the finfish differently than it would affect shellfish. So while there's now definitely scientific consensus that microplastics are contaminants, it's not a one-size-fits-all definition when we're studying them and trying to better understand their impact. Next slide, please. So let's talk about impacts. Why are we so concerned about them making their way into the world? Generally, there are sort of 2 buckets of concern. Those are based on microplastics' physical or chemical properties. So because microplastics do have a physical shape, they can become stuck in the gills or guts of fish or filter feeding organisms. The shape and the sharp edges, for example, of a rigid piece of plastic might injure an animal's gastrointestinal tract as they're swallowed or cause inflammation inside of the animal as that plastic travels through. And when animals have too many microplastics in their gut, they can feel full and stop eating, which can ultimately lead to starvation and death since plastics don't actually provide any nutrition to the animal. And those are all considered sort of physical impacts. Next slide, please. The second bucket here are chemical impacts related to additives and ecotoxins. So there are several thousand distinct chemical additives used in plastics to make them flexible or resistant to heat or make them smell good or, antibacterial. Some examples of those are written inside of the blue fiber here. And those additives can constitute over 70% of a plastic product's total weight. Unfortunately, some of these additives listed here and incorporated into plastics are associated with both environmental and human health risks. Microplastics are also really good at collecting contaminants, things like ecotoxins from the surrounding environment. And a few of those contaminants include heavy metals, pesticides, etc. So we do know microplastics enter the environment in a variety of different ways. Ultimately, because they're so small, they are accessible to the entire marine food web, the tiniest plankton, as you see here, all the way up to these large fish, which we consume. Therefore, the plastics and the additives associated with them, the ecotoxins on the plastics, ultimately end up on our dinner plates. Next slide, please. So the bottom line here, we'll be sending around a fact sheet later this week with all of this and plenty more, but the bottom line is this: microplastics are everywhere that scientists have looked. They have measurable negative impacts on the environment and on wildlife. So that's a real beef primer. Thanks, Chelsea. Back to you.
Thank you, Britta. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and jump into a discussion amongst us, which means I get to ask the first questions. So the first question I'll start with is for Matt. And Matt, the question I have for you is, what ultimately led you to write this book? And actually, first I'll congratulate you on it. I did read it and I enjoyed it. And so we're curious, what ultimately led you to write it? And was there a single study or figure that flipped the switch for you or something else?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, great to be here. Great to talk about the book and hopefully shed some light on this contamination problem. I think for me, it was really the atmospheric studies that made me particularly interested in microplastics. So a lot of people might have heard of microplastics research starting in the oceans, finding it in plankton. It was back in the early 70s where researchers were beginning to find this stuff. But in recent years, as Chelsea's research has also shed light on, is this stuff is moving through these various environments quite readily. So it's taking to the atmosphere for one. It's probably moving between the ocean and the atmosphere and then back into the ocean. And it's on the land. So for me, it was these atmospheric studies that really began to quantify just how much of this stuff is in the air. And it's an extraordinary amount that it's all falling out of the sky. Janice Brainey over in Utah is doing some great work on this. And I visited her for the book. So that for me was really the interesting revelation here, that it's not just all going into the ocean where it's staying and causing negative effects, but it's moving through these various compartments in the environment. And nobody had yet done a popular science book that really gathered up the state of the current knowledge and the current research. So I wanted to do that. And here we are.
I love that that's your answer, because the very beginning of the book just paints this beautiful picture of you walking up the mountain with Janice talking about the work that she did. So I agree. I think it's fascinating what they're finding, and just this idea that it's cycling in the atmosphere and in our dust cycles is quite breathtaking. So on this note of how the science is changing and transforming over the years as we understand more, Britta, the science around plastics, as Matt just said, inspired you to write the book on the topic. So Britta, you keep up with the latest scientific findings. What information has come out in the last 6 months that advances some of what Matt covers, or introduces something new that closes a research gap or inspires a new question?
Yes, thanks, Chelsea, and thanks, Matt, for a little bit of background there. Uh, it's actually really tough. There's an impressive body of research coming out almost every day in the plastic space, but luckily can narrow it a little bit down since we're talking specifically about microplastics today. I think there are 4 papers I'm going to just try to quickly highlight that have come out since August of last year. The first was published in November. And for that paper, scientists analyzed whale foraging behavior and concentrations of microplastics at different levels in the ocean off the California coast. And they aimed to estimate microplastic uptake by blue whales. And hopefully a lot of you saw coverage of this paper in this issue. But the scientists determined that blue whales off the coast of California likely consume up to 10 million microplastics every day, which is equivalent by weight to about 95 pounds. And that's mostly due to the consumption of krill for food. So you remember that slide with plastics transferring up the food chain? That's a great example of that occurring. And they also did an extrapolation over a feeding season that can equate to one blue whale taking in over 1 billion microplastics, which can be up to 11,000 pounds. So that's pretty massive. And it really highlights how microplastics are so prevalent at every biological level of organization, from the tiniest plankton to the largest whales. Another paper I'd like to share is a really important reminder about human exposure to microplastics as a result specifically of using single-use plastic products. So researchers quantified the shedding of single-use plastic cups into hot and cold beverages they contained. This was late last year as well. They found that hot liquids shed more microplastics from the cup into the beverage than cold liquids did. They also found that simply using one plastic cup every 4 to 5 days can expose you to roughly 90,000 more microplastics per year than if you were to skip that plastic cup altogether. Again, I like this study because it's a really good reminder that we're impacted by plastics and that skipping single-use plastics can have benefits more than just preventing pollution in the environment. And the final 2 studies that I thought were really thought-provoking, and one of them relates to the atmospheric presence of microplastics that Matt was talking about. The first was that researchers sort of turned to the sky and determined that microplastics and nanoplastics, they can actually change light absorption of clouds, a term called albedo, which is important because clouds help regulate the amount of solar radiation that our planet absorbs. So the authors note, right now, the actual climate impacts may be negligible just due to the concentrations. You have to compare that to aerosols, but this is definitely something to monitor in the future as we expect more microplastics and nanoplastics to be emitted. So something to keep an eye on and something to study further. And the last study I'll mention really reinforces the idea that degrading plastics in the environment can have large, broad-scale implications. They can actually release dissolved organic carbon. So researchers found that environmentally relevant concentrations of plastics degrading in seawater when they're subjected to UV light lead to lower seawater pH levels, especially if the plastics have been aged prior to studying. So degrading plastics release carbon that promote acidification. And the reason I'm highlighting this is because notably the authors calculated that in coastal areas, degrading plastic waste may lead to a drop in pH of 0.5 units by the end of the 21st century, which is actually comparable to some of the most extreme acidification projections due to climate change. So those are some of the very recent papers I found interesting. Hopefully they spur some questions or reflections. So thanks, Chelsea.
Thank you, Britta. And so those facts that you point out, some of them are a little bit daunting. And I think, Matt, you even had parts of your book where you were going through some of these facts, and you even had parentheses in the book of, I promise you soon I'll get you solutions. It's not all doom and gloom. So let's turn to those. And actually, I really was intrigued and appreciated actually the title of chapter 5. And so I noticed that the title of chapter 5 was turning down the plastic tap rather than turning off the plastic tap. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about your choice of words and kind of what I guess motivated the title, and tell us a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I'm a realist, and the editor, when she was going through the book, was saying, "Can we get more solutions in here?" I understand you're a realist, and this is a big, daunting problem, but can we do as much as we can to talk about solutions? And there are quite a few. So I went with turning down because for the foreseeable future, there are a lot of things that we can do to actually keep both microplastics and macroplastics, like bottles and bags, from escaping into the environment. So when it comes to turning down the tap, the issue with not being able to turn off completely is that we have an exponential increase in the production of plastic. So as we keep producing more and more plastic, it just gets ever harder to keep the stuff from escaping into the environment. And I go through the book talking about different strategies for turning down the tap, one of which being filters on washing machines. So this is a major source of microfibers into the environment coming off of our polyester and nylon clothes. Put filters on there that can actually keep them from getting into the environment. But then, of course, you have to figure out a way to safely dispose of those fibers, so you're not just throwing the trash and it's taken to the air in the atmosphere that way. But when it comes to macroplastics, like bottles and bags, I think it's really important to think that those are just pre-microplastics. So any of those bigger things are just going to get into the environment, break down to tiny, tiny bits. They deconstruct. They're still out there as plastic. They're just micro now. So things like one of my favorite pieces of technology in the world, it's in the book, is in Baltimore Harbor. It's a barge with giant googly eyes. It's called Mr. Trash Wheel. What it does is it collects floating plastic coming out of the river before it has a chance to get into the ocean. So when scientists talk about these mitigation measures, ways to turn down the tap, maybe not necessarily getting down to turning off the tap entirely until we can massively curtail the production of plastic, there are these seemingly small things that I think can add up to something really impactful. And the urgency here is that if we let the plastics industry keep increasing the production exponentially, we're just going to get deeper and deeper into this toxicological debt.
Great, thank you. And we're all smiling because we also love Mr. Trash Wheel in Baltimore.
The best, love it.
Oh, the best, yeah. So Anja, over to you, thinking about these policies, thinking about some of what Matt just discussed and the work you've been doing on the Hill. Can you talk about, I guess, first of all, whether you agree with this sentiment about turning down the plastic tap, and then also what policies can we hope for to help reduce the risk of microplastics to humans and, of course, also the environment?
Thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, I absolutely agree with Matt's perspective here. This is such a big and complicated issue that it's really hard to imagine turning this issue off in its entirety at this moment in time. But as Matt was saying, we have so many opportunities to reduce our emissions and our production that when layered together, we can have not just a reduction, but a significant reduction. We can really start moving the needle on the issue. In grad school, I studied technologies that can help do this. And what we realized is that we really need to go further upstream than just looking at the technologies. We need to actually make system level change, and that requires policy. And the first thing we can do with policy, as Matt was saying, is to first and foremost, make less plastics. The easiest way to make sure less plastics and microplastics get into the environment and into our own bodies is to make less stuff in the first place. We actually did this just last year in California, passing the first ever law to require less single-use plastics. I actually just jumped off the first call implementing that bill with the state regulatory agency. It's called SB 54. And I'm really excited to see California take that up, as well as other states that we're now working with to kind of tackle these macroplastics or pre-microplastics. I like that term, Matt. And then for microplastics, we can also do a lot more. You know, Matt mentioned some of these really specific actions that we can do to address kind of the common sources of some of these microplastics, washing machine filters, Oregon, California, New Jersey. These are just a handful of the states that have legislation on that very issue moving forward this year. Not to mention, France already passed legislation requiring these washing machine filters to trap microplastics. We can tighten regulations on the manufacturers of plastic pellets so that we prohibit all of those pre-production pellets or nurdles that my colleague Britta was talking about from being discharged into the environment. We can also work with our regulators to make sure they're doing their jobs and protecting and monitoring what we eat, what we drink, and what we eat and drink out of, to make sure that we are safe and not getting, not having too many of these microplastics in our food and water products. So there's lots that we can do there with policy. And thanks to the work that, Chelsea, Britta, and of course, Matt are doing to like pull all of this together into access for our policymakers, it's really compelling and, charging up a lot of interest in taking action on this now and moving forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a few more minutes before we turn to questions from the journalists in the room. And instead of asking you each the same question, I'm going to ask you each 3 different questions. So I'm going to start with you, Britta. And that is, you work for Ocean Conservancy. You've been researching plastics for a while and including in the ocean. So I want to think about, or have you talk to us about, what makes this an ocean issue? We spent a lot of time today thinking about the atmosphere and sewage sludge and I don't know, drinking water. What makes this an ocean issue?
Thanks. Yes, we did talk a lot about those things. Unfortunately, when microplastics enter the environment, they enter this kind of global microplastic cycle, which Chelsea was one of the first scientists to kind of coin the term of. And so that means that plastics kind of move among and between different environmental compartments, and ultimately the ocean turns out to be an unfortunate recipient of many of those plastics and microplastics that we generate on land. There are, of course, exchanges of microplastics between the ocean and land in the atmosphere, but the science also shows that the ocean's a pretty major sink for some microplastics as well, especially when those fall through the water column and settle on the deep sea floor. But obviously, plastic pollution is also an ocean issue because important ocean animals are being exposed to and harmed by those plastics of all shapes and sizes. These animals hold a tremendous amount of significance in our world today. They're cultural cornerstones, they're key food sources, they maintain balance in our fragile ecosystems. So it's very much an ocean issue, but it's also a freshwater issue. It's also a terrestrial issue, and it's also a human health issue.
Excellent. I agree. Like you, I started my work in the ocean, but it's really hard not to start working in freshwater and on land and thinking about solutions upstream. So, okay. So Anja, I'm going to go over to you and then I'm going to end with Matt. And so thinking about the policies we discussed and kind of the breadth of the issue and the depth of the issue, are you optimistic about microplastics or plastic pollution in general?
Wow,
or I guess solving it.
Oh, what a great question. Yes, I am absolutely optimistic. You could say it's because I've only been in this field for, 5 to 10 years and haven't gotten beaten down or jaded. But I actually think it's because in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen major progress on this issue. From legislation like the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act that I helped write, being introduced and getting more and more co-sponsors federally, to California passing SB 54, along with 3 other states that have now passed extended producer responsibility legislation. And then again, California kind of setting the stage in terms of addressing microplastics by leading on science, looking at risk assessments and how you could try to regulate some of the water bodies based on how many microplastics are actually out there. I think that when we look at the plastic pollution crisis, we think of it as this really long time span because we've been looking at plastics and we've been making plastics since, the 1950s, but half of the plastics we've ever made have been made in the last 20 years, really close to the last 18 years. And so we have the next 20 years to turn the ship around, and with really, all the excitement that we see in the policy space, from the local to state, federal, and now at the international level, I'm really excited and optimistic that we can absolutely do this.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. I also share your optimism. 15 years has not brought me down yet, but we'll see. Matt, final question. And this is a question that will take us into Q&A. So what is one thing that you want us to know going into that question, into Q&A, meaning what is the one thing we did not cover here that you think our audience should know in case you don't get asked a question that allows you to share it?
Something that I always try to bring up in interviews, podcasts, things like that, is the very direct, explicit connection here to climate change. So plastics are made out of fossil fuels. This is the same industry. So the same people that have caused climate change have caused catastrophic pollution of plastic in our environment. So the writing here is on the wall for the fossil fuel industry that we're going to decarbonize. We're going to use fewer fossil fuels as fuels to burn and use more of those fossil fuels to make plastics, tripling production in the next couple of decades. We don't have that luxury. The planet does not have that luxury. The more that we produce, the more that we see this exponential rise of microplastics in these different environments, in ocean sediments and in peatlands and things like that. So that's what I always try to drive home here, is that if we let the fossil fuel industry get away with this, they'll sure produce less fossil fuels as fuels, much more plastic. That comes with a ton of emissions to produce those plastics. And as we've hinted at here in some of these questions, that as these things are in the environment, they're off-gassing carbon. Maybe they're influencing the way the clouds they're forming. They are in beaches and they're raising the temperature of sand, potentially impacting sea turtles who have sex determination. The hotter the temperatures, the more females turn out of clutches. That could be messing with those species in particular. So it's this really insidious kind of pollutant, and that is this physical thing that can change the structure of clouds and change the way that sand heats up, all the while off-gassing this carbon. And now is the time to act drastically with things like a plastics production treaty to cap the production there, because left to its own devices, the industry is going to run even more wild than they have until now, and our environment is going to suffer all the more for it.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to turn to questions from the audience, and we'll start with the journalists, and then we'll turn to the people that are watching on YouTube. But for those of you that are on YouTube, please feel free to ask questions at any time, because we'll be recording them and they'll be coming into me through the chat. So they'll just be there in a queue for later. So please feel free to go ahead and type those in. But first, for the journalists, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand feature, and we'll actually unmute you so you can ask your question. So when I call on people, you'll get sent a request to unmute, and then you'll have to unmute yourself on your end. And then once you're fully unmuted, you can go ahead and state your name and your outlet and ask your question. So if you have questions, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll be watching in the participants list. I think I see our first question, and the first question is from Mariel Garza. So we'll go ahead and ask you to unmute yourself. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my question is about research, and I'm wondering if there are any studies in progress now about human impact that are worth following up and paying attention to.
I think I'll take that first, and then Matt or Chelsea or anyone, feel free to follow up after me. I'm definitely not a human health expert, not that kind of doctor, as I always tell my family. But I do track the science around what we know about potential impacts of plastics on human health. We're still looking into it. It's extremely difficult to study. Since, like we mentioned, microplastics themselves vary so widely in terms of their shape and additives. But there was a study, I think last year, that was really interesting, showing that microplastics can induce cell death in humans. Ingestion of these particles is also correlated with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. And then a lot of the chemicals associated with plastics, like bisphenols, which are endocrine disruptors, bisphenol A, for example, those show correlations with chronic illness, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So I would say the entire gamut of human health research related to plastics is really interesting. And I'm hoping that cumulatively we can take that information and hopefully come up with human risk thresholds like we do for heavy metals. A certain quantum of microplastics in the blood causes risk, et cetera. So I would say the entire gamut of the human health microplastic research is really interesting, but would be curious to hear from Chelsea or Matt or Anja as well.
Yeah, I could just add to that we have pretty good quantifications of how many we're ingesting. And breathing. So in the indoor air, one of the higher estimates was 7,000 particles breathed in a day. This is obviously going to differ from person to person. So you might be surrounded with more or less plastic in your home. You might have carpet versus hardwood. So we know that for sure it's not good to have any of that kind of particulate matter in your lungs. We also know, as Britta said, that we have these chemicals with known toxicity. The question now, and this is where the studies will come out in the next few years, I think, is, well, how much is too much of this microplastic to have in the lungs? We have, even before microplastic studies really started taking off, back in the late 90s, there were some studies of people who worked in synthetic textile factories who obviously were inhaling far more fibers than you and I would, but they had higher rates of lung cancer and digestive cancers. So we're waiting for, I think, those really good studies. It just takes time to put together good science on the human health impact, just because this field is quite new. It will take time, but it's to be determined, because we're exposed in so many different ways: inhaling, drinking, eating. How much of it is just passing through us just fine, and how much is too much to have in the body? So look out for those studies, probably the next couple of years, hopefully.
I would just add one thing, which, as Matt was just saying, it's really hard to do good studies on this. And one of the challenges is that we all have such a baseline exposure that is really hard to quantify. So it reminds me in some ways of the early days of research on per and polyfluorinated chemicals, PFAS, and they tried to do an IRB controlled study, I believe in Denmark or Sweden. I can't remember. There was and they tried, and they set up these perfect control groups, and they ended up not being able to complete the study because the control group had too much baseline contamination. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting, complex challenge for researchers going forward, is how do you understand and quantify these impacts, knowing you need to do a lot at the cellular and molecular level, because human exposure and epigenetics and things like that are really complicated to measure, given how much baseline we all have at this point without realizing it.
Thanks to all three of you. This is a question that sort of follows along the same lines. And this question is from, I think, someone in the room, Jamie Reppert, and it is, do reusable plastic cups? So I think, Britta, this question came while you were talking about the study on single-use plastic cups. And so the question is, do reusable plastic cups, such as sippy cups, also shed plastic into the beverage? So if anyone wants to comment on that, and I guess in general, just kind of how the use of plastic, single use or not, may get into our food or drink.
Yeah, I might start that off again as well and pass it along. But the unfortunate answer is yes, reusable plastics do in fact shed microplastics into beverages. There was a study, I believe it was published in 2020, looking at the migration of microplastics from infant bottles into infant formula when they're prepared in the bottle. Obviously, bottles are not single use; you reuse them. The study I'm looking at now determined that as many as 16 million microplastics can be liberated into the infant formula when you do prepare it that way. So yeah, unfortunately, this seems to be a plastics issue. Perhaps I have a toddler myself, and I've been trying to use glass baby bottles because I saw this study come out. And so sort of shifting our mentality, if it's possible for you to look into different types of preparations. But there's a whole body of literature about food and beverage packaging and how those shed microparticles into the foods and beverages we consume. So Matt or Anja, if you want to add on, or I can continue. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I think I would just add that it's very important to consider just in general the things that are known to break apart plastics. So that is heat and cold. So putting hot water in a plastic cup is a big no-no. That's part of the infant formula problem. Freezing things, so like frozen foods in bags, unfortunately, as convenient as those are, that's another thing that tends to break apart these plastics. They're tough, but they're not indestructible. And then out in the environment, it's more about UV bombardment that further breaks down these things. And I guess I would just add that when we're talking about infants, we need to keep in mind just how much smaller they are than adults. If they're getting dosed with this many microplastics, do we need to consider the fact that they're, first of all, developing still? A lot of the chemicals in plastics are endocrine disrupting chemicals that can mess with hormones, but also considering, in addition to what they're eating and drinking, toddlers crawling around on the floor where we know a lot of these particles are settling. So there's these different routes of exposure. Vacuum a lot is the best I can say, and do not heat or freeze plastic under any circumstances.
The only thing I would add to try to shed a tiny positive light, which is really not much here, is that we've never really gone through and required producers to think about this. And so we are just now starting with some of the textile industries and others to start saying, like, policymakers and regulators are considering regulations, which kickstarts a whole lot of innovation from the production side in terms of how would you meet regulations for sheddability, for microplastics, microfibers, things like that. We've never forced our producers to take that into consideration, which means there's a lot of innovation left at the, on the table, both in the plastic space, but also in other materials that could rise to meet the challenge that's being left behind by plastics, whether it's other forms of, natural fibers, pulps, things like that. So I think the next, 5 to 10 years, in addition to all of the great research we'll see, we will also see a lot of innovation, both in the material space and hopefully in the green chemistry space as well, in making sure that a lot of the other additives and chemicals in our products are being shifted towards, more natural additives for colorants and things like that. So we're not also exposed to that, whole host of contaminants that Britta talked about early on.
Thank you. If anyone else has questions that are in the room, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll keep an eye on that. For now, I'm going to take a question from the YouTube, and that is, this is for any of you who wants to answer. How much carbon emissions are associated with plastic alternatives?
Maybe I could jump in on that one since I was rambling about climate change earlier. So I think you might be referring to things like bio-based plastics. So these are like any plastic, traditional plastic is chains of carbon derived from fossil fuels. Bio-based plastics get those carbon chains from plant materials, so usually corn or sugar. Unfortunately, you're still making a plastic, which has a lot of the same additives that make plastic a plastic, heat resistant, flexible, that sort of thing. So bioplastics still break down into microplastics if they're getting into the environment. Bioplastics come with the additional issue that theoretically, yes, if you're growing those plants and turning them into plastic, you're capturing carbon from the atmosphere. But there was a calculation a couple of years ago that looked at, I think they were saying, okay, to replace all of the single-use plastic in Europe, I believe it was, you would need enough land that would cover France and more water than all of Europe uses in a single year. So it's shifting the burden elsewhere. So you get more carbon emissions from just this industrialized agriculture. But then coming back to this idea that as these plastics escape into the environment and break down, they off-gas that carbon. So you're getting the carbon from a theoretically greener source in that you are capturing carbon when you are growing the plants to make the plastic. Unfortunately, that carbon is just escaping elsewhere. But then when we're talking about these alternatives made from a fungus or something, we need life cycle assessments of how much power it took to produce those plastics, how much water potentially. We can't just let these companies say, hey, I have the perfect alternative to plastic. We need scientific assessments of how exactly they're better carbon-wise or toxicity-wise.
I think that's absolutely right, especially looking at those like life cycle assessments. Those are really hard to do on like apples to orange with materials. So you really need a lot of them done to be able to compare. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning with carbon emissions with plastic alternatives is looking at kind of some of the other traditional materials we think about: paper, aluminum, glass. There's not one perfect material out there. And the thing that really unites all of these materials together in terms of reducing carbon emissions is recycling. The more recycled content that you have in any material type, the lower the carbon footprint is, because it's getting towards that circular economy where we're ultimately extracting and using less virgin natural resources. So paper is highly recyclable. And if we're actually recycling it, it means you're not going out and clear cutting forests, even if they're grown for, paper production. Same with aluminum and glass and things like that. And so that's really the climate thread here, is making sure that we're really closing that loop on our materials to make sure that we're, decreasing the amount we use in the first place, so we can close the loop and have it be an amount that is actually sustainable in the long run.
Okay. Great. Thank you both. I'm going to go to another question that is more about solutions, but it's not about what policymakers can do or governments. It's more what we as individuals can do. So the question is, what can we individuals do to help combat the microplastic problem?
Yeah, I think I can start there. I would say just being a conscientious consumer of plastics is a really great place to start. As Matt said, pre-microplastics are synonymous with the big items we use in our daily lives, and the fewer of those we use that we don't need, that's going to provide an environmental benefit. It's less likely that those items will become pollution and break up into microplastics and cause all of these reverberating issues throughout our marine ecosystem. So I would say being a conscientious consumer of plastics across the board in your daily life is really important. And I know there are some policies we are working on at Ocean Conservancy related to laundering. I'll just prime that really quickly. As we mentioned in our chat, fibers derived from clothing and textiles we wash in our homes travel through gray water out into the environment. And it provides a really awesome opportunity for us to use technology to intervene those microplastics before they go out into the environment. So perhaps Anja or Matt can talk to microfibers specifically and other interventions.
I can jump in then. Yeah, absolutely. There's some really innovative technology out there that we're looking at for machine washing of textiles to reduce microfiber shedding there, policies that would require producers of those washing machines to build that type of technology in. So the onus, again, is not on consumers. There's also really small tips and tricks on how you wash your clothes, starting with just washing your clothes less frequently. It sounds gross, but our clothes aren't actually meant to or need to be washed like every single time you wear them, especially when we're looking at things like fleece, denim, really highly shedding types of fabrics. Washing them on cold with less detergent. There's a whole host of kind of tips and tricks that I know Britta knows better than I to reduce the shedding from those textiles. And I think we have some information on that. The other thing that I would say that we can each do on an individual basis, it does relate to policy, and I apologize, but that's my job, is just using your own voice to talk to policymakers. Ocean Conservancy has a bunch of action alerts you can fill out. There's emails that you can send. They're really low-hanging fruit opportunities for every single person just to tell your senator, tell your representative, tell your local or state representatives, hey, I care about this issue. Hey, I want you to do X, Y, or Z on this bill. I want you to vote for it. I want you to vote against it. Whatever it is, I know because I worked in a Senate office, track that. They track the number of people talking to them about this, telling them to vote yes, telling them to take action, and it really does move the needle. So it's hard to imagine that as one person, you're doing a lot every time you send that email, but when it's you and thousands of other folks that are all joining together to send that email, it really is impactful.
That's totally spot on. And maybe I could just build off of that a little bit and talk about like the bigger picture here, which is that I think it's great to do individual action, and that can certainly add up into a big collective action. I try to explain as much as I can in the book that we cannot let the plastics industry do what the fossil fuel industry did generally with climate change, which is blame it on individuals. So like it's your fault that you're flying too much. Oh, you're responsible for climate change. BP invented the idea of the carbon footprint to shunt the responsibility onto consumers. So when we're talking about writing to senators, it's about amassing this collective action as individuals into the only way that we're going to make movement here against this plastics industry, which is legislating it. So great that you can actually reduce your exposure to microplastics in the home by getting a filter-free washing machine or vacuuming more. But we can't let the industry do what they did with climate change and blame it on the individual. Oh, it's your fault that our environment has become so contaminated with microplastics because you're doing something silly with your clothes. No, it's like it's doing the legislative work here, and as individuals, we actually have a lot of power there. But also just the word of mouth to, I think, really change the tide here against single-use plastics. Like bananas, I can't believe I have to say this. Bananas don't need to be wrapped in single-use plastic. They have skins. Same with cucumbers. I think as that gets more absurd, we actually maybe get more of a momentum here against the industry that this is absolutely out of control. Any of that macroplastic is really just pre-microplastic.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going to jump back to human health for a question that I have here from Jamie Reppert, and this is besides ingestion, and the question is very specific to plastic microfibers, so whether or not those plastics could be absorbed through the skin when we wear them, but maybe if you can answer this question in relation to maybe other exposure pathways to microplastics beyond ingestion, including dermal, but also any other pathways there may be. And I'll turn it over to whoever wants to go first.
I can just say really quickly, I can't speak a ton to the dermal contact and dermal uptake, but it is considered a route of exposure, especially for the really small microplastics and the nanoplastics. But this route is often more associated with the chemical additives in plastics like bisphenols and phthalates and chemicals like those that are typically incorporated into the plastic. So yes, it's a possible route of uptake, but relative, I think, at least the current science is relative to what we're taking in through inhalation and the foods we eat, it's probably a less significant route of exposure for sure. And I really like that Matt brought up earlier, our estimates right now of human exposure to microplastics, what we take in, those are based only on what we inhale and 8 different food groups. And that's because we do not have good information on things like microplastics in different proteins, terrestrial proteins in particular, in grains and things that we eat a large quantity of. So there's still a lot of work to be done on figuring out microplastic burden in many of the foods we eat so we can better hone in that human exposure estimate.
Okay, I have a follow-up that's also on this human exposure estimate. You walked us right into the next one, Britta. And this is how much, I don't know if we know this answer, but maybe one of you will. How much baseline plastic does an average person contain in them?
That's hard. I think I had mentioned earlier that we live all such different lives, right? So it's really difficult because you can't do like a body scan and be like, oh, there's 10,000 particles of microplastic in this person. I think what's the really daunting thing here is that, as we were talking about earlier, everybody's exposed in some way. So it's actually somewhat difficult to do human health studies because you don't really have a group of people that isn't exposed to microplastics to compare that to. It's a little bit gross, but we do know what's coming out the other end of people. So we have analyses of human feces and finding lots of microplastic there, but we don't know how much is actually getting stuck in the gut, how much is actually passing through the gut. So when we're talking about nanoplastics, that's getting down to the size that can theoretically, and in mouse studies, have been shown to pass through the gut. Nanoplastics are small enough to get into cells, individual cells. And we are finding, I think in recent years, more and more studies that are quantifying, okay, in lungs, we found this much per person. Microfibers in particular seem to be like perfectly shaped, almost like asbestos, to kind of get into the branches of the lung. They're finding them in gut tissue, all sorts of different human tissues. Almost certainly the brain can probably pass through the blood-brain barrier, but how much is going to be too much? Again, so it's in our bodies. We know that. We know that there are severe health effects for people who work in textile mills, but we just don't get that kind of exposure. What is going to be too much, and how much do you as an individual have in your body is anybody's guess. But this is the really scary thing here is that we've let this plastics industry do this experiment on us, and now it's up to scientists to figure out the consequences. Sadly, and hopefully they aren't too terrible. I'm being optimistic, and I will end on that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we do know humans excrete microplastics per that study Matt cited of finding microplastics in human waste. There have been estimates thinking perhaps we excrete 90% of what we take in, but we don't know what happens in our bodies between the time we take in the microplastic and the time we excrete it. What are the chemical, physical implications of those plastics in our body? And then what happens? What are the long-term impacts of those that we retain in our bodies? So those are some top concerns. And it's important to think through ways you can limit your microplastic exposure every day. Studies resoundingly show that bottled water contain far more microplastics than filtered tap water specifically. So unfortunately, that's an environmental justice issue. Not all places in the world have access to clean filtered tap water, but we need to make that available to people because we don't want them exposed to microplastics simply as a result of their environment with no choice to be made.
Thank you both. We have a question. We have one question in the chat from YouTube, and then we have a raised hand. And so, Jamie, I'll turn it over to you first. We will go ahead and unmute you or ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I was just wondering, where do the little spherical beads that keep washing up on the beach come from? Are they like made like that, or is that the ocean action on plastic actually?
Good question. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I can take it. Sorry to always start these off. It kind of depends, Jamie. There are two types of microplastics that might fit into that category. One of them are actual microbeads, which used to be really common in rinse-off personal care products. They're not commonly found in the environment anymore, thankfully. But those are, specifically sphere-shaped. They were meant to be an exfoliant in things like face wash and body wash and toothpaste. But probably what you're referring to are those pre-production plastic pellets called nurdles. And those do leak into the environment fairly frequently, especially if they are spilled at plastic production facilities or during the transport of these little nurdles, because again, those sort of form the foundation of the large plastic objects we have in our homes and use every day. So those are the likely nurdles that you're referring to. And there was a large-scale spill off Sri Lanka of nurdles. Was it 2020, 2021, where there were just container ships full of them that were spilled. So there are some monitoring programs off of Sri Lanka that are looking to track the movement and prevalence of those nurdles over time, which is really interesting. And science is definitely a great tool we can use in this microplastic space to learn more about the problem and how these things dissipate in the environment. Great question.
Oh, sorry. Those caught on fire too, didn't they? The Sri Lanka spill, and it's like burning plastic, which is bad. I think I talk about it in the book as, think of these as oil spills. It's oil in a different form, but it behaves in a much different way in that these nurdles travel great distances. These nurdles were actually one of the first documentations in the environment back in the early 70s. A researcher was finding them in fish stomachs. These look almost identical to fish eggs. So any fish out there that feed on fish eggs are mistaking them for actual food. And I think, as mentioned earlier, this leads to food dilution. They're filling up their stomachs with something that does not give them sustenance. These nurdles are so easy to spill. It's like, I think I quote a researcher in the book, it's like sand slipping through your hands. They spill at every step of the production process. And unlike an oil spill, which tends to be mostly contained to a surrounding area, these things can travel probably thousands of miles and then get into some other fish stomach somewhere else.
And there is, there's a federal law out there that should, prohibit a lot of these spills and prevent, the source pollution from the transportation and production of these. It's the Clean Water Act. Unfortunately, our federal government is not using the Clean Water Act to its full extent to regulate these nurdles. And there is a federal law that's been put forward for the last, I think, 3 years at least, the Plastic Pellet Free Water Act, that was part of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, and then introduced separately because it is such a common sense piece of legislation that would essentially tell EPA, our federal agency in the United States who's responsible for implementing the Clean Water Act, to say, hey, these are a pollutant, just like everything else we measure and monitor in our water streams. You are responsible for keeping the waters of the United States clean, livable, swimmable, usable. Please go and regulate this industry and ensure that there's no discharge of these nurdles. And so if you're interested, there's legislation out there that we've been working to pass for a while.
We are almost at time, and I see 2 questions in the chat that are related. So we'll end with these. They are about solutions. I think it's good to end on solutions. We know that the world right now is trying to figure out what the global plastic treaty will look like. And there's a lot of discussion around building a circular economy so that we are not kind of make, take, and waste, but we're reusing the materials. So the questions that I'm merging is, and Anja, I'm going to turn this over to you, is how close do you think the corporate sector is to adopting circular economy models? And when something doesn't fit in a circular economy, it can't be recycled and it has to go at, what is this question? Sorry, I want to get this wording right. If something can't be recycled, what's the proper way to dispose of it?
Great questions. On the first one, how close are corporates to adopting circular economy models? I think it's important to kind of separate out who we're talking about. There are a lot of companies that use plastics. These are the brands we think of for buying products, packaging, all of that. And then there's what kind of Matt was alluding to, the people who make plastics. And that's really just an extension of the fossil fuel industry, as we heard. So that half, not close, right? That is their plan B business model, as Matt was talking about, really diverting our fossil fuel industry away from transportation and electricity and into petrochemicals for the production of plastics. Now, the corporates who are using plastic as packaging, as part of their products, there's a mixed bag there. And I think ultimately there are good intentions, and there have been a lot of companies that have come out and put out voluntary statements about the circular economy, extended producer responsibility principles, all of that. That is awesome. And the rubber is going to meet the road, to talk about another source of microplastics when it comes time to pass legislation, because ultimately we can't put this in the hands of corporates to self-regulate. We have seen time and time again that if it's left to their own devices, they'll set out grid targets, they'll make ambitious plans, and then nothing will happen. And so it's time for our regulators to step in the form of legislation. And we're seeing really good progress there. So 4 states in the last 2 years, well, I guess we're 23 now. 4 states in the last 3 years have passed extended producer responsibility. The entirety of the European Union will have extended producer responsibility, circular economy type policies by 2024. We're seeing this international dialogue on a legally binding instrument that we're hoping to see really strong producer responsibility, CATs, other types of actions in as well. In terms of the proper way to dispose of plastics if they can't be recycled, I'll give 2 answers. The first is a kind of a cop-out answer. We need to make plastics that can be recycled. There is no place in the market for plastics that can't fit into our circular economy. And that's exactly what we're doing in California with SB 54. You cannot be a single-use plastic sold into the state by 2032 unless you can be actually recycled or actually composted in the state. So you must have a way of being circular in the next 10 years. There's 10 years of time to kind of figure out how to do that. And other states haven't passed that particular policy yet. And honestly, if there are plastics out there, it's better to landfill and trap them in an engineered, safe environment, as opposed to letting them leak out into the nature, be burned, as Matt talked about, in incineration or chemical recycling systems. All of that creates a whole host of more environmental harms and environmental justice harms. So really, we need to work upstream here because the other options are not great.
Great answers, Anja. Thank you. Okay. Well, we are at time or over time. So thanks everyone for joining us and sticking with us for a few extra minutes. As Britta mentioned, I think Ocean Conservancy will be publishing a fact sheet on microplastics on its website, oceanconservancy.org/plastic facts. But please do not hesitate to reach out with additional questions. And also I want to give a big shout out and a thank you to Matt Simon. Thanks for sharing your book with us and thanks for sharing the hour. So thanks everyone and have a great day.
Thanks.